Hola, buenas tardes. Good evening. Today we are going to switch into English, and we are very happy to have this webcast on climate change, energy, and its Asia. And also, I'm very happy to start this lecture series with Professor Blai Warné and Professor David Sauri. I will give the floor to them. First to Professor David Sauri, who will explain the lecture series and will give us more information. And I would like to thank once again Professor Dent for being with us and talk about this very important topic, maybe more than ever. So, David, the floor is yours, and thank you to all of you again.
Thank you very much, Rafael. I welcome to this session, to this seminar, and I want first to thank Asia for the invitation and help in organizing this meeting. I have to say that last year we also had a pretty ambitious program of conferences. The first, we could get the first one, which was 1 week before the lockdown, but that was it. So we had a really nice program organized, and everything, of course, went down the drain because of COVID and all that. So this year we hope we can do it. Everything is programmed to be online, so hopefully we won't have any problem. And I want to thank you all for sharing with us, for coming to this online seminar. This will be the first talk of a series of 6 that are programmed from today until July. One every month with different topics related to East Asia, from the environment and energy and climate change today, to cultural issues, to environmental conflicts, to global governance, to China in Latin America, and all sorts of different topics by real specialists. Before I go on, I introduce Professor Christopher Dent. I will give the floor to my colleague, Professor Blai Warné, who will tell you a little bit about the reason that we are organizing this series of seminars, which is our master's program of Global East Asian Studies. So, Blai, whenever you want to say something.
Thanks so much, David. Muchas gracias. I was telling you that actually I'm going to switch to Spanish because I'm seeing that we have with us former students of our BA program, María José, Ida, Sergi. So I'm going to now to voy a explicaros un poco el programa de máster que tenemos entre manos y que de hecho nos gustaría que conocieseis. Es el máster, ahora estoy compartiendo pantalla, el máster oficial en Estudios Globales de Asia Oriental. Como sabéis, y por eso nos reunimos hoy aquí, Asia Oriental es una de las zonas más dinámicas del planeta en muchos niveles, en el nivel económico, financiero, medioambiental. Hoy el profesor Christopher Dent nos dará una conferencia sobre ese tema, en los flujos poblacionales y también en las influencias culturales que está diseminando en todo el planeta. Pensar en el boom del K-pop, del J-pop, de la literatura japonesa, de las series coreanas, del drama, pero no solo en eso, pensar también en China como la fábrica del mundo, como la segunda potencia económica mundial, Japón la tercera potencia económica mundial, la implicación de Corea del Sur, por ejemplo, en los procesos de cooperación y de desarrollo en Latinoamérica, o, por supuesto, todas las influencias culturales, políticas que vemos en los últimos años que emergen desde Asia Oriental y que convierten a Asia Oriental en un actor de peso. De hecho, Asia Oriental ha desbordado sus límites regionales y es imposible entender la región de Asia Oriental sin entender su impacto, su presencia en el mundo. Es de esto de lo que trata este máster oficial en Estudios Globales de Asia Oriental, del cual os invitamos a visitar nuestra página web. Son 60 créditos, es un año. Es un máster que impartimos 50% en español, 50% en inglés, y en el que veréis que tratamos contenidos que van desde los estudios culturales hasta las relaciones internacionales y políticas, por supuesto la economía y todo lo que tiene que ver con el comercio internacional. temas medioambientales. David Sauri, que es el coordinador del máster, es nuestro especialista en esto, y nos gustará mucho que visitéis nuestra página web y podáis ver exactamente cómo estamos desarrollando este programa, en el que nos gustaría también del que formaseis parte. Como sabéis, la Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona lleva más de 30 años desarrollando el programa de estudios de Asia Oriental. En los años 80 empezamos con la enseñanza de las lenguas, chino, japonés, coreano. En los 90 desarrollamos los primeros grupos de investigación y proyectos de investigación competitivos, y en los 2000 empezamos con la docencia primero de una licenciatura de segundo ciclo y después del grado de Estudios de Asia Oriental, del cual creo que algunos de vosotros habéis sido alumnos y por tanto ahora sois alumnos de nuestra universidad. Bien, pues después de 10 años con este programa de Estudios de Asia Oriental hemos podido desarrollar este máster, que es un máster que va más allá del enfoque de los estudios de área, y esto es del conocimiento intensivo de una región, en este caso de la región de Asia Oriental, para aunar a este enfoque de los estudios de área el enfoque de los estudios globales, y esto es la presencia, el impacto de Asia Oriental fuera de Asia Oriental, una Asia Oriental desbordada que de hecho se ha convertido, como comentaba, en un actor de peso, en un jugador de peso en las dinámicas globales, y que está llamada de hecho a caracterizar las interacciones que ya lo estamos viendo que explicarán el siglo XXI. Bien, no me alargo mucho más porque de hecho lo que nos interesa hoy es escuchar a Professor Christopher Dent. So, David, when you want, the floor is yours again.
Okay. Thank you very much, Blai. Just now, a brief introduction of Professor Christopher Dent. Professor Christopher Dent is professor in economy and business in Edge Hill University in the United Kingdom. His main research interests are the relationships between the economy, trade, energy, and climate change, and also about the impact of East Asia in the world economic system. He has published 14 books, more than 100 academic papers, and probably, I don't know the number, but probably quite a number of reports. And he has been advisor to the governments, the British government, the Australian, Chilean, German, Swedish, Japanese, South Korean, the United States, also for international organizations like the Asian Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the European Commission, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, and even some private companies like the company Nike. And he has given many talks, and I'm reading here that in Asia, Europe, North and South America, Africa, Middle East, and Oceania, I think only the Antarctica is left after, as far as continents are concerned. But I'm sure that sooner or later you'll be giving a talk down there, maybe. So it is a real pleasure to introduce Professor Dent again, and who's going to talk about one of his main areas of expertise, which is energy and climate change in East Asia. Professor Dent, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's wonderful to connect with you all my friends, old and new, in Barcelona. It's really wonderful. Thank you very much. I really value the opportunity to meet with you all and to also present what I think is a pretty important kind of theme for understanding East Asia in the wider global community, global economy, and global system. And I'm going to just share my screen now and start my talk. So the title of my talk is Climate Change, Energy, and East Asia. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a kind of an overview of the relationship between East Asia, energy, and climate change. And it's going to be quite globally focused for most of it. It's also going to be centered primarily on energy. So you're going to be learning quite a bit about not just renewable energy, green energy, but also where we're standing at the moment regarding fossil fuels and also nuclear energy. And in addition to that, how energy is connected to various other kind of challenges and key issues that face both East Asia and the rest of us and the wider kind of global community. So let's start off by just talking a bit about climate change. Now, of course, it's something that has become increasingly familiar to us. And I'm not too sure what level of knowledge you have about climate change, but essentially an increasing percentage majority of climate scientists believe that anthropogenic, that is human-caused climate change, is happening. Currently, the consensus is around 98%, and that keeps on steadily rising. Okay, so let's take it as a kind of conventional scientific knowledge that anthropogenic climate change is happening based on an increasing wealth of data to support that claim. Now, what is actually causing climate change to happen globally? It is essentially rising greenhouse gas emissions, and especially carbon dioxide, because carbon dioxide represents around 80% of all greenhouse gas emissions. Why is carbon dioxide emissions, why are they rising? It's primarily due to energy, as I will show you, in its various forms, how we produce it, how we consume it. So energy, essentially, by these causal links, is the prime driver of anthropogenic climate change, and it has been for some decades. Now, I'll kind of explain now why this is important to East Asia. Now, as we know, East Asia has been the most dynamic, fastest growing region on the planet for the last 5 or 6 decades. Okay, in 1950, it represented 4% of the world GDP. By the end of the 20th century, it was around 30%, so more or less equivalent to the other great 2 economic poles in the global economy, the European Union and the United States. Now, if we look at the nature of East Asia's economic development, it was very energy intensive, because energy has very close connections, of course, with economic development, and especially certain forms of it are very energy intensive. Manufacturing and heavy industry, like the production of steel, chemicals, cement, and also construction, the construction of buildings and infrastructure. Connected to this, urbanization is a very energy intensive process or aspect of economic development. Then there's fossil fuel sector development itself, which is, of course, a cause of carbon emissions by the very nature of us extracting them actually out of the earth. Rapid economic development, rising material prosperity, all of these are associated as being quite energy intensive forms of economic development. So if you look at that list of especially energy intensive development, you can see that East Asia's own development is a very close fit to the above. It's been very energy intensive, and I'm going to show you some data on that a bit later. So we are now in a situation where East Asia is by far the largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions in the world, more than any other region. And China has been a key driver of this. So in 2006, it seems some way away now, 15 years ago, China overtook the United States as the largest single nation annually emitting greenhouse gas emissions and CO2, carbon dioxide. However, it's not quite as straightforward as that, because you have to understand how East Asia fits functionally into the global economy. Because you could argue that East Asia's economic development is partly a function of globalization itself. So, for example, if you look at China's exports to the rest of the world, about 50 to 60% of its exports derive from foreign invested enterprises working in China. Okay, so Apple, it assembles its iPhone in various component factories around the world, and it mainly assembles them in China. What does it do then? It then exports them to world markets. And the same you could say for a number of different industries. So East Asia has become, and especially increasingly China, the world's cheap manufacturing hub, making cheap manufactured goods for the rest of us. And foreign companies in China are part of that whole process. So we have to understand that the large amount of emissions in China and other East Asian countries are part of East Asia's integration into a increasingly globalizing economy. We also have to remember that even though East Asia is a bit of a villain on the carbon emissions side, it is also the region that produces the most clean energy technology, such as solar and wind, geothermal, and it also has installed the most clean energy technology by far compared to any other region. In addition, we have to think about the historic climate responsibilities of all nations, especially in the higher income nations, and in particular, those in Europe and North America. And I'm going to come back to that particular issue a bit later on. Now, notwithstanding all those points, the challenges of decarbonizing East Asia are absolutely enormous and are part of a bigger global effort to decarbonize the global economy. This is not just something we have to leave East Asia to do alone. Climate change is a global challenge. It requires not a kind of a tribal nationalistic approach to solving it. It requires a global society effort. So we are all stakeholders in decarbonizing East Asia and our whole global system. Now, I'm going to talk a bit about COVID as well. And of course, you probably have picked up in Barcelona and Spain, where, as well as where we are here in Britain, that the COVID crisis has led to a number of debates about how we can, as we say in English anyway, build back better, to reset economic development on a more sustainable path. A crisis always creates opportunity for structural and paradigm change. Okay, the bigger the crisis, the more the focus on changing the order going forward. Like the Second World War did in the middle of the 20th century. COVID could provide a kind of an opportunity for us to reset and to go forward. So the key question here is, will East Asia take this opportunity? Will it take this new direction to build back better and to put us on a more sustainable path of development? Okay, so what we got here is a little bit of climate science. What I want to do is just summarize that climate change is about three main problems, and they're kind of interconnected. So the first is global warming. And in fact, this is what we used to use as a term to mainly describe climate change when it first started to be used back in the 1980s. But global warming, rising average global temperatures, is a key aspect of climate change. Secondly, the rising trend of extreme weather events that are occurring, floods, droughts, storms, and so on. And then thirdly, rising sea levels. Now, I think it was David said that I haven't quite been to the Antarctic yet. It's quite ironic that the opening slide that I had was of melting sea ice in the Antarctic. I promise I didn't cause that, well, not directly. But rising sea levels is going to pose a number of potential risks to East Asian cities in particular, as I'll explain at the very end of this talk. Now, let's look at some data, shall we? We're going to focus on some global energy data. So what we have here is primary energy demand by region. So there are three main forms of energy consumption. We use it to generate electricity, we use it for transportation, and we use it for so-called thermal purposes like heating, cooling, and cooking. So what primary energy demand is a combined aggregation of all those three forms of energy use. Okay, so electricity or power generation, transport, and heating, cooking, and so on. And you can see that Asia is on a completely different trajectory in terms of its energy demand and has been really for the last 2 decades. And this is estimated not to change going forward. Now, relatedly, which countries in Asia are responsible for the largest slice of primary energy consumption? And you can see that China is by far the largest from the Asian group. And this includes not just Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia, but also the South Asian states like India. Just trying to get control of my slides. There we go. Okay. Now let's look at the most carbon intensive fuel, coal. Coal has, up until quite recently, provided China with about 60 to 70% of all its power generation, all of its electricity. It has an enormous number of coal-fired power stations, China. It also sits on 40% of the world's coal reserves. And it is obviously being used in very, very extensively because it is cheap and accessible. And it's also, you don't have to import it, and therefore doesn't present any energy security of supply predicaments for China. Now, these are figures going back to the reform period, and you can see that China's coal production compared to the rest of the world and other key countries like India and China has just been ramping and ramping up. You can see an acceleration here from the mid-2000s, and then it's been leveling off in more recent years. Now, a few years ago, President Xi Jinping announced a war on pollution because it was killing, on average, according to World Health Organization figures, around 1.5 million people in China prematurely a year. So it overtook smoking as the primary cause of premature deaths in China. And you've all seen the images of dense smog in many of Chinese cities caused by aggregated, accumulated carbon dioxide emissions in nearby power stations, providing power for these burgeoning, fast expanding Chinese urban zones. Now, the thing about coal is it doesn't just cause climate change kind of issues, more global climate change and rising CO2 emission problems. It's also causing some other major issues, of course. So localized air pollution I've just mentioned, and in addition to this, severe water stress problems. Because the way that a thermal power station like coal works is it requires a very, very large volume of water, fresh water, in the production of coal, of thermal power, where coal is heated up to generate very high pressure steam, and it requires a lot of water for that process. And that is causing a lot of water security and water stress problems actually inside China itself. Now, I mentioned earlier about energy being the primary cause of climate change, and because of our dependence on fossil fuels, and that causing carbon emissions and other greenhouse gas emission problems. So what we got here is a couple of pie charts. This one on the left shows you that carbon dioxide represents about 80% of all greenhouse gas emissions. Another is methane, CH4, which is actually even particle per particle, even worse than carbon dioxide. And there's a lot of methane which is trapped underneath the Siberian permafrost. And if the Siberian permafrost starts to melt seriously due to rising global temperatures, due to carbon emissions keep on ramping up, then that is going to cause severe problems for us all, not just in Siberia. But what you got here is just a generalized picture of where the energy consumption derives from. So you've got, for example, up here, you've got iron and steel. chemicals. So kind of the use of burning fossil fuels to generate these really important strategic industrial materials that we all use, including materials that have been used to make the devices in which you're watching me here today, whether it's your phone or your laptop. Now, China is responsible for producing half the world's steel, half the world's cement, and around half the world's aluminium, right? Come on to that a bit later. You've got other sectors here. You've got transport broken down, road transport, aviation, shipping, and then you've got energy use in buildings and so on. Okay, so you can see that energy is front and center at the reason why greenhouse gas emissions are rising and where they derive from. Now, this next slide, I think I've gone one ahead. I think I've gone one ahead of myself. Excuse me, have I? No, I haven't. Sorry, I've forgotten where I was. Anyway, what this next slide shows is the historic accumulative CO2 emissions going back a number of decades. Now, it depends on the starting point. So, for example, for the UK, the starting point is 1751, okay, because we're the first industrial nation. And but the inner circles shows you the historic accumulative CO2 emissions up to 1960. The outer one, just pointing to my own country here, the UK, represents the accumulative CO2 emissions, carbon emissions, up to 2010. So the gap between the inner and the outer is between those 5 decades, 1960 to 2010. Now you can see that for UK, there hasn't been too much increase. Part of the reason why the UK has actually reduced its carbon emissions in more recent years is because we've offshored all our industry to countries like China or India. Okay, we've deindustrialized, but our British companies are still producing stuff just overseas in places like China. Then if you look at China's CO2 emissions from 1960 to 2010, you can see there's been a huge increase over time. However, and this is a big however, if you look at the United States, there's been a slower growth, but historically, it's still responsible for more carbon emissions than China. Now, this is very key when it comes to climate diplomacy and agreeing on how much each country should be reducing their carbon emissions. Okay, because the Chinese can point to the Americans and the West Europeans and say, well, look, okay, yes, we are a large emitter now, but you've got to take the whole historic picture into account and account for the historic carbon responsibilities of your nation over time. That's something we can discuss a bit later if you like. So what are we looking at here? We're looking at here the a more recent well, not more recent really, I guess it's the last 5 decades of trends of CO2 emissions globally and also by major country or regional group. So if we take this graph here, we can see that, for example, the EU 28, which includes Britain, which is pre-Brexit, thankfully. And you can see that Europe's carbon emissions, and we're looking here at millions of tons of CO2 per year. So that's 5 billion tons there. Okay, that part of the axis there. You can see that Europe has actually reduced its CO2 emissions gradually, especially in the last couple of decades. Likewise, the US has brought its down, although of course it still emits a lot more than the US than Europe does on aggregate. But look at China. China's been rising. Overtook the US, as I mentioned, in 2006. And then if we look at the table on the right-hand side, I'm just going to have to move my Zoom bar over so I can see it. You can see some figures on a per capita basis. And what the per capita figures of carbon dioxide per head were in 1980, and then more recently, in 2018, when we have the complete international figures for that year. Now, you can see that, for example, if you take my country, we've reduced our emissions per head for that reason, deindustrialization, offshoring our industry to Asia and other parts of the world. The The US is still very high at 16.1. That's about twice the EU average. But China has increased its emissions per head from 1.5 to 8, over that 8 tons per head in that period. Japan's has actually still gone up a bit, and South Korea's has gone also up and is in one of the highest in Asia. Now, why is that? That's because it's like Japan, South Korea, and also like China, has a large manufacturing sector. Okay, you mentioned earlier that manufacturing involves a number of very intense energy processes, a lot of heat, a lot of power, okay, to convert iron into steel and then to make steel panels to be assembled into car production. So manufacturing is a very energy intensive and carbon intensive process if you're relying on fossil fuels to create the energy to make these goods, and also to develop your urban industrial zones in your country. And then we've got some other countries there too. You can see Indonesia and Malaysia and Singapore. Also, Singapore quite high, but that's because it's really a city-state more than a nation-state. It's quite energy efficient, Singapore, but it still has one of the largest petrochemical complexes in Asia and in fact the world. So, and also, quite industrial too, as on a kind of per capita basis. So, okay, there's the picture on kind of energy and climate emissions. What about renewable energy? Will it come to the rescue, both in East Asia and in the rest of the world, in terms of helping us solve climate change, to mitigate carbon emissions, to put us on new paradigms and paths of clean energy use, reduction consumption, create a new energy society in East Asia and the rest of the world? So this is one of my main areas of research, renewable energy. Let me give you the kind of global picture. So what we have here are a series of graphics taken from the REN 21 Global Status Report 2020. This is the latest aggregate data on renewable energy at a global kind of level. So I'm going to introduce quite a few of these graphics and highlighting where East Asia appears in them. And you'll see that it appears quite a bit. Let me just take a bit of water, first of all. So let's look at the overall picture of final energy consumption. So we're taking, again, those 3 different forms of energy: power generation or electricity, transportation, and then thermal, okay, heating, cooking, cooling. So you can see that fossil fuels still dominate. About 80% of all our final energy consumption is still fossil fuels. And then if you look at the position or shares of renewable energy, you can see that you're going to have to just moving things around from the Zoom functional bars and charts and stuff. You can see that modern renewables is taking an 11% share. Traditional biomass, this is relating to the use of things like wood to burn for heating and also cooking in lower income countries. That's what's non-modern renewables, you could say. So that still accounts for a very large share of total final consumption, of energy consumption, about 7%. And then you can see that nuclear up there is at 2.2%. And we only use nuclear for power generation, for electricity. Now let's look at the 3 different energy sectors in the next slide. Let me get to it. That's it. So here we have a breakdown of the 3 different sectors. Thermal energy, which represents 51% of all final energy consumption. Transport, which represents 32%. And then power or electricity, which represents 17%. Now you can see that the share of renewable energy in power generation and electricity is quite high at 26.4. If you go back about 10 years ago, the figure was around 18, 19%. And when you see renewables in the news, in the press, on TV, it almost is completely, almost always focused on electricity, on solar PV, on wind turbines. Yes, there's increasing stuff about electric vehicles, but you can see that, in fact, on electric vehicles, only 0.3% of the transport sector is electrified. That is, electric vehicles are being used. The other 2.7% of renewable energy's contribution here is biofuels. Actually, no, 3%, sorry, not 2.7. So the use of bioethanol, biodiesel in various vehicles in certain parts of the world. But if you look at thermal energy, you can see that renewables only makes up 10% of all the power used for thermal heat purposes. And most of that is the use of bio-waste in industries where bio-waste tends to happen, such as food, drink and tobacco, and also paper and pulp. More about these sectors as we go through the slide. So let's first of all look at power generation, electricity. What difference has renewables been making there? Well, if you look at the net additions to capacity, that is the new power stations that are being built, an increasing share of new additions to the power grid is coming from renewable energy. At the moment, you can see from this figure here, it's around 70%. So in 2019, renewables, and this is excluding large-scale hydropower, is really outcompeting fossil fuels and nuclear. And you can actually, if you look at the figures, there's been more investment in building new solar PV installations than coal, gas, and nuclear combined. So on the power generation front, green energy is making a huge advances. And we're going to look later at where East Asia comes into that process. So if we now look at it per sector, if you try to understand the contribution that renewable energy is making by sector, then you can see that of the 27.3% that it provides, over half of that is from hydropower. So this comes from mainly large hydropower dams. Now, China is responsible for about 25-30% of all global hydropower. And I'll come on to hydropower in a moment in China. Now, hydropower has been around for some time. In fact, the very first national grids, which were created about 100 years ago, most of them actually were based on hydropower electricity. So hydropower was the original kind of national power grid, then got overtaken by fossil fuels as the 20th century went on. You can see that from the figures as well, about 6% of all world electricity is generated by wind, about 3% from solar PV, over 2% by biomass power like wood pellets co-generated with fossil fuels. And then the rest, geothermal, CSP is concentrated solar power. That's using mirrors to heat up water and create steam like a normal thermal power station. And then ocean power is still experimental, things like tidal wave and what's the other one? Tidal wave, tidal currents, tidal barrages, other very high-tech stuff to do with oceanic water temperatures. So, okay, now that's the overview then of the global renewable energy picture. And I'm just going to go on to the next slide. And this just shows you where the annual net additions is coming from. You can see solar is way out top there. Wind is next, hydropower, and then the other renewable energy sectors. Moving on to nuclear, what's been happening to nuclear power, just very briefly? Well, the global nuclear industry was actually in decline before Fukushima, which, by the way, had its 10-year anniversary last week on the 11th of March. And most countries are kind of divesting from nuclear, okay, because of the huge risks, but also it's become quite expensive compared to solar and wind for generating electricity. Now, it does have the benefit of being what's called a baseload energy source, which means it can always provide energy for you constantly. It doesn't have to rely on the wind or the sun or some other meteorological phenomena. But it's on the decline, except that China is still got plans to invest quite significantly in this sector. But I can take some questions on nuclear later, if you like. This is the picture for solar PV. Now, you can see here in this graph the breakdown of the major players in this sector. And you can see that from the time that the Europeans and the Americans started to apply major trade barriers of exports of solar PV equipment from China, that China turned to its own market to sell the stuff. And it's been doing so at a very fast rate. So you can see the contributions that China's made to the constantly rising new capacity of solar PV globally. China's increasingly driving the growth of this sector. Now, solar PV is the fastest growing energy sector and has been for the last 20 years. In 2004, China made about 5% of all solar panels globally. It now makes between 65 and 70% of all solar panels, and has installed more than any other country now by some distance. It's helped drive down the price to very, very low figures. I'll come on in a moment to comparing the different energy sources across countries, but just to give you a personal kind of insight into this, this week I had solar panels fitted to my house. I've been meaning to do it for years. They're from China, a company called Jinko. When I first got a quote to get solar panels fitted to a previous house, the quote I was given then was literally 5 times more than the price I paid now. So you're paying now for solar about 20% of the price that you would have been quoted about 10 years ago. And part of the reason why solar's come down is because China has ramped up and scaled up the production of this energy to make it affordable for us all globally. It's made a major contribution to clean energy provision globally. On wind energy as well, China is increasingly the dominant player. It has 4 or 5 of the world's top wind turbine manufacturers. It has installed more wind energy than any other country by far. It has got some infrastructure problems with it, but it's been a major driver of the wind energy sector, which has been the second fastest growing energy sector in the world since the early 2000s. It also makes not just large wind turbines, but also makes very, very small ones on hundreds of thousands of those. And offshore wind is an area where China and other East Asian countries like Japan, which is trying to develop offshore wind, as is South Korea. That's where the next big kind of frontier of the wind energy sector is. And they certainly have the engineering expertise to do it. This is another chart showing you the important role of China in terms of adding new wind energy capacity. You can see that in 2019, again, it was the top contributor to adding new capacity. So in that year, 26.8 gigawatts. Just to put that in context, that's probably just under half the Spanish national grid capacity. And you can see other players too. India are a big player in the wind energy industry. Japan have been actually surprisingly quiet on this sector. They've tended to kind of focus, well, there's a very strong industrial lobby behind the development of Japan's solar power industry. But as I'll mention wind a bit later on when I come to Japan's recently announced green growth strategy. Hydropower. Just a bit on hydropower. You're probably aware that in the last 2 decades, China has gone gung-ho for large-scale dams, such as the Three Gorges Dam that goes across the Yangtze River. It's around 2 kilometers long. It is rated at 22.5 gigawatts. Now, what is a gigawatt? I'm sure you're asking me, Professor Dent. Well, a gigawatt is a lot of energy. The UK national grid is 95 gigawatts. Okay, so just put it in context. This one dam represents a quarter of the UK's national grid capacity. It has these monster great big wind turbines, has 32 of those. You can see them parading them proudly down the streets in a city in China on its way to the dam. 32 of those. Each of these is 700 megawatts capacity. That's about the size of kind of a large to medium to large wind farm. Is one of those. You can generate that much power. Now, what about the price of renewable energy compared to fossil fuels and other energy sources? This information here shows you what the cheapest energy was in the market, the electricity market in 2014. So you got coal, gas, and wind there. Fast forward to 2019 and look at how cheap. I'm starting to move things around here so I can actually see the stuff myself. If you look at what's happened here with how wind and solar have become cheaper, including wind in China now the cheapest way to generate electricity, it's been a remarkable turnaround in the last few years. However, if you look at this column here, you can still see that coal is the cheapest form of electricity in Japan, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, South Korea, Thailand, and Vietnam. There's still some way to go, but solar is increasingly becoming affordable in an increasing number of countries. And China and other Asian countries have helped make that possible. What about in the other linked energy sector of battery storage? Now, battery storage is really, really important because it enables you to be far more flexible with solar and wind energy tapped into the grid. I've actually got, as part of my PV system here, I've got a solar, I've got a storage battery, which is currently probably helping charge up this laptop as I speak. So it's been charging up all day from excess solar generated from the sun. Yes, it does actually. We do get sun here in North England occasionally. But you can see again that Asian countries, East Asian countries, are at the forefront of ramping up this storage capacity. That's going to be vital to the future of our clean energy systems globally. Now, some of the toughest nuts to crack, though, we've just been looking at power generation. The toughest nuts to crack are going to be in transportation and they're going to be in thermal energy. So what we've got here is first of two slides showing you the percentage of these heavy industry sectors to global, the global kind of greenhouse gas emissions. You can see that iron and steel is by far the most significant contributor from industry to global emissions. And the thing about producing iron and steel is it's difficult to use electrical power to generate sufficient enough heat to convert iron into steel, right? You need temperatures of up to 1,200 Celsius to do that. Similar high temperatures you need in chemicals and in cement. Now, you need lower temperatures in sectors such as aluminium. I'm sorry that the text hasn't quite made it all the way all the way onto the slide. Anyway, but here is a picture of what is the current energy requirements of each of these heavy industries regarding what fuel source they use. So if you look at iron and steel and also cement, you can see that fossil fuels account for, and also chemicals as well, at least 80% from fossil fuel sources. So if you look at iron and steel, the predominant energy source there is coal. For aluminium, you can see that electricity is used because you can use what are called electric arc furnaces, because converting bauxite, which is the base material from which we make aluminium, it doesn't need to be heated up to the same temperatures as you need to heat iron up to convert it into steel. So what they're doing there is they are using electricity. It's called sector coupling. So you can generate enough power, heat power, from electricity in that sector. The problem is that China is increasingly the dominant player in the aluminium sector. It represents about 50% of all global aluminium production, and it's been using coal to generate the electricity. So what you need to do is get China to use renewable energy to generate that electricity for aluminium. The other option you have, and this is still a very frontier technology, and you may have heard of it, is green hydrogen. Now, green hydrogen technology has the potential to decarbonize options in these heavy industries. And if you remember, I said at the beginning, these industries represent a very high percentage of carbon emissions, about a quarter of carbon emissions. So it's really important that we make sort of progress here. But green energy technology is roughly where solar energy was back in the 1980s. It's about 5 times more expensive to use than conventional fossil fuels. So it needs policy support to scale it up, make it cheap, make the technology more improved, and the infrastructure to actually roll it out as well. Now, I've just seen the time. I need to kind of accelerate on a bit here. What about cars? Now, excuse the puns, but I couldn't resist them. Here is China's contribution to the rapidly increasing number of electric vehicles, driving the world forward on EVs. But there's still, as I mentioned earlier, a huge distance to go on electrifying road transport. We've only really just started to begin this process, but China is making a lot of electric vehicles, and possibly also cheaper for all of us going forward. Also, China is leading the world by far on electric buses. It has almost over 500,000 of them, and it's showing the world the route ahead on electric buses, but other countries need to get on board. Another shameless excuse for a pun there. But you see, so China is investing in all these technologies. It's trying to do renewables fast, but it's also doing nuclear fast, and also still doing fossil fuels, especially gas at the moment, fast. That's the key challenge for us. So just a couple of slides now to kind of summarize of text. Take another sip of water. Okay, so East Asia and climate change. Right, so the region is highly diverse. If you take East Asia to be, China, Japan, Korea, and if we add the Southeast Asian nations in, it's a highly diverse kind of region, and its responses to climate change have also been highly diverse. Most lower income nations in East Asia have less climate impact, lower emissions and so on, but they're still prioritizing more immediate socioeconomic issues more highly, such as poverty reduction. So Indonesia is a massive subsidizer of fossil fuels because it sees that cheap energy is a way of alleviating poverty, reducing the kind of everyday expenses for poorer Indonesians. It sees subsidizing fossil fuel as kind of realizing that objective of poverty alleviation in the country. Higher income nations such as Japan and South Korea still are quite carbon intensive because they've got quite large manufacturing sectors, and they're lagging behind the EU counterparts such as Germany, Spain, France, the UK on their ambitions to decarbonize their economies. Their targets on renewable energy, for example, are nowhere near as ambitious as they are here in the EU. And as we have seen, China is doing everything fast. And the key thing to remember about East Asia is what I call the new developmentalist or new developmentalism approach, where you take its very strong developmental state capacity and you combine it with the ecological modernization approach of greening capitalism, following green industrial strategies, green growth strategies. So you basically, you keep the main structures, but you green them. And you can see that East Asian countries are increasingly turning to these kind of strategies, turning from a conventional 20th century industrial strategy into a 21st century industrial strategy based on the industrial scaling up of renewables, of also nuclear in some cases, and of creating things like eco-cities and energy efficiency technologies. And if you look at the media, you can see that there's increasingly green finance recovery measures that have been implemented by East Asian governments, and new green deals are likely to be introduced this year or maybe sometime next year. And you've also got the Asian regional institutions such as the Asian Development Bank, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, APEC, Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, the G20 group, which of course South Korea, Japan, China, India, and other Asian countries are part of, and they also try to push for this. Now, regarding the developmental state approach or new developmentalism, in December 2020, Japan introduced its green growth strategy. Here is Japan's Prime Minister Suga announcing the launch of it. And you can see that this is just one part of it, but it's an important core part. That energy is, oops, sorry, that's China. Energy is front and center here of its green growth strategy. But notice how it also includes nuclear power. This is despite the fact that nuclear power is increasingly unpopular in the Japanese society. If you go back before Fukushima, about 65% of people supported it in Japan. Now it's about 10% of people, according to recent survey data. China, what about China? Well, this is its Made in 2025 industrial strategy, where it selected 10 industrial sectors on which to base its next kind of innovative indigenous innovation in development plan. And you can see a number of them are relating to climate friendly or kind of climate technologies such as new energy and energy saving vehicles, renewable energy, advanced kind of public transport, which you could argue is also kind of green transportation, high-tech ships, and so on. And then if you look at what's going to be happening soon with the launch of the 14th five-year plan, 2021-2025, you can see again, as you've seen in previous plans, eco goals, stuff on green industrial policy. China is aiming to peak its carbon use by 2030 and then become carbon neutral by 2060, which is 10 years after Japan's 2050 carbon neutrality target. And here you've got some other goals that should be revealed in the 14th five-year plan. Now, my cuckoo clock has just struck 7, so let's 8 your time, of course. But just some key points just to end, okay? So East Asia and climate change. So it will be very well that, East Asian states governments embark on these ambitious green growth strategies and green new deals and green recovery measures of post-COVID and, taking the opportunity to build back better after COVID. And I think it has obviously focused their minds a bit like what happened after the global financial crisis of 2008, when you had similar strategies emerging as a response to that particular crisis. This one, of course, goes much deeper. And you could say that it goes more deeper and penetrative into society. Now, this kind of strategy making, this top-down approach has its limitations. This is all very well for technocrats to policymakers to make these strategies, but they've got to actually make a real difference on the ground, and people have got to respond positively to them. So what you need to do, in addition to devising these fancy kind of strategies, is also to try to bring society along with you and to foster a deeper sustainability culture in both society and in business. You've got, though, the problem of very deep entrenched industrial vested interests in the region. So like the coal lobby in China and in Indonesia. the nuclear power lobby, which is very strong in Japan. Another problem you've got is the impact of COVID on government finances and politics, which may limit certain climate policy options. There may be more pressing socioeconomic problems to sort out post-COVID, poverty, water supply, shelter, and so on. And there is a chance that the environment and climate action may be put on the back burner for a bit. But so there is this kind of delicate balance of knowing that we have to do something different post-COVID, but will we have the resources to actually do it? Can we generate the finance to take us onto this new path? Now, the key thing to remember is that we're all in this together, right? It's another global crisis. And the internationalized links that East Asia have should augment its climate action efforts. So there's a broader global societal need for a kind of build back better reset. And this concept I've kind of devised of World War C, World War COVID, World War climate. This is the closest that many of our generation have felt to experiencing a global war, even though it hasn't been like a conventional war. But now we're kind of, there is this kind of solidarity globally emerging within civil society and across nations to fight for our planet. Okay, that's World War climate, not war. Well, it is kind of war against the climate because of what we've been doing for the last 200 years with industrialization. But now we've got to actually find a resolution and harmonious solution to everything. So climate diplomacy as well, how this develops over time. Various climate summits. We've got one coming up in Scotland at the end of this year. But there are also climate diplomacy going on at various levels between cities, civil societal organizations, the scientific community, and so on. Also, what's interesting to track, and I teach my students about this, is what's happening to business culture and how sustainability is increasingly shaping the culture of business in the 21st century. Businesses are under pressure and also themselves are going through a cultural change to try to reposition themselves as part of being purposeful organizations within human civilization, right? So they're repurposing their objectives, seeing themselves as part of human civilization, human civilizational project, not just organizations to generate money. Now, that's happening to some extent, especially in the big business groups. But that's something else to keep an eye on, okay, when we're looking at how East Asian companies are also embracing climate change, because East Asian enterprises and business still represent in most economies the majority of economic activity. Now, failing all of this, a major climate or environmental catastrophe will focus East Asia's minds. But let's try to avoid that. But just to let you kind of ponder on this, this is a map of climate risk, mainly in the Eurasian landmass. The darker the blue, the more susceptible those parts of those zones of Asia here are going to be to climate change risk. That's mainly due to extreme weathers and rising sea levels. This is just an artist's impression of what Shanghai would look like if the average sea level rose, let's say, by 1 or 2 meters. Don't forget, most of Asia's population are on big coastal cities or in river delta areas. Rising sea levels, if a big iceberg the size of, I don't know, Spain breaks off and melts into the sea and rises sea levels by 1 or 2 meters, that will focus minds even more, shall we say, than probably COVID-19 will on actually getting change done. That's it. Thank you very much indeed for paying attention. Very happy to take any questions in the time we have left.
Thank you very much, Professor Dent, for this really illuminating talk with lots of data and information. And now I think it was suggested that I we can take a few questions, of course, and I see some. We can do that through the chat. Maybe will be easier if you post questions through the chat. Will that be okay? Otherwise, we have.
Yes, we have a few already.
Okay.
We have a few free questions already. Can you see, David?
I can see the chat, but I don't see any questions there. Just you to.
Yes.
Okay. I have a few. They were sent by WhatsApp. So if
sure.
Maybe it's easier if I read the questions.
Yes, please do. Yes.
So I have the first one is how the decision of the Biden administration to rejoin the Paris Agreement is going to affect East Asia.
That's a really good question. Yeah. Well, obviously, it's excellent news that the US has come back to Paris. It's going to be absolutely vital. It will obviously augment international responses to the climate agreement, Paris Accord of COP21 agreement. Yeah, you need the US at the table if you're going, and be proactive as well. So the US has got a number of its own challenges. I mean, what's been interesting about the United States at the states level and also in the corporate community is that they have been following. Most state governments in the US have actually been still pledged to following the goals of Paris, the Paris Accord. It's only the federal government under Trump that wasn't, but still, it's really important that the US sends a signal that it's back on the table. We don't know still how that will impact on Asian responses, but you can imagine it puts more pressure on countries like China and Japan, South Korea, to up their game. It will depend on how interactive Biden can be in future climate summits, which happen every year. So we've got COP26 coming up in Glasgow in November. So, yeah, we'll have to wait and see, but it is very encouraging and positive news.
Okay. Well, I have to admit it was my question. So.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, so excellent question.
We have another one. This one is from Sofia, and she says China is one of the countries that is investing the most in clean energy and has committed to reduce massively in its carbon emissions in the next decades. But it's also one of the countries that is most polluters. How does the Belt and Road Initiative impact or influence China's commitment to become carbon neutral?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the Belt and Road Initiative is a lot about building infrastructure for transportation. And it's quite controversial from that respect because although, China is building things like high-speed train links that can help decarbonize international trade to some extent, it's still a very heavy construction kind of project. And many of the projects are also geared towards extracting resources from African countries, from other Asian countries. So it's not an easy, it's such a massive, multifaceted project. It's not an easy question to kind of give a short kind of evaluation on. But there are environmental benefits, but also costs with the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, I know that Xi Jinping has recently said that it's going to be kind of green investment, and it may well have aspects of it which lead to lower carbon emissions or lower greenhouse gas emissions. But still, it's a very large, the world's largest construction project ever devised. So, yeah, it's not an easy question to give a short answer to that one. But there are a lot of different issues to discuss with the Belt and Road Initiative from an environmental and climate change perspective.
We have another one. It's connected to the nuclear waste management from China. And the question is, where China is storing their nuclear waste?
That is a very good question. I'm not too sure what the answer is to that. And maybe there are only, say, 12 people who know exactly where that waste is going at the moment. The thing about nuclear is it's a 20th century technology. It's a mid-20th century technology. There actually hasn't been, there's this project for nuclear fusion. But nuclear fusion could be decades away. Nuclear fission technology, although there's dozens of different kind of types of nuclear plant you can have, but it hasn't technologically advanced. There haven't been new technological breakthroughs in nuclear fission in the same way that there has in solar PV and wind energy, for example. It's also very costly because they are very expensive to build, they're very expensive to run, and they're very expensive to decommission, and they're also very expensive to find suitable locations for the radioactive waste, which remain radioactive for 25,000 years. So you have to be really, really careful where you put it, the waste. To me, it's had its day. You see, nuclear power stations can also only run for about 40, 45 years. They have to be decommissioned after that due to certain scientific stuff. I'm not quite sure I fully understand. But, they have a relatively low shelf life. And it's just really, really expensive. And it's been outcompeted by solar and wind.
Okay.
Yeah.
I guess it's underground.
Yeah. We see. In answer to that question, yes, underground, very deep underground, very deep. Yeah.
Well, I don't know if David, do you have any question, or do you want to comment something else?
I have questions myself, but maybe among the public there is someone else that want to raise the hand, or just I'm unable to see the chat. But
I've got a question in the chat box.
You do? Okay.
It's from Sophia. It says, you mentioned the limits of a top-down approach, coercive environmentalism, as it requires to foster a deeper sustainability culture, but this takes time, yes. Do we have the time? What are your thoughts on the effectiveness of this top-down model, considering the urgency of the situation versus a bottom-up approach? That's a really good question. That's something I've been thinking about a lot in East Asia. So I'm not a kind of a sociologist, so there's a lot that I don't know about this. But if you look at the countries that have made the biggest advances on sustainability and are willing to make the investment in sustainability, it's countries such as Scandinavian countries like Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, where you've had quite a deep environmental culture for a number of years. So Norway, for example, has by far the highest ratio of electric vehicles in the world. Sweden are the leaders on green hydrogen steel manufacturing. Also, Copenhagen is one of the most sustainable cities in the world. And it's what East Asian governments have to focus on. They have to build up this kind of sustainability education, environmental education from the very bottom. It has to be fed through the education system. Various other kind of community education kind of projects, just as we've needed it in Britain over recent years. So it is a long-term strategy. As Sophia says, you can't change culture overnight, but there has to be a strategy on it. Mm-hmm. And that's been missing, I think, from a lot of these top-down bureaucratic devised strategies, which is very technical, industrial-based, technology-based, but you really need to bring society along with you to, for example, want to buy solar PV for your rooftop or invest in an electric vehicle or just recycle more. So, yeah, a really good question. Thanks for that, Severe. I've got another question. David, do you have another one?
Yeah, I have a question for you. This is a tough one, Christopher, because you can be also quite critical on renewable energy. There are a number of problems that you need to face when you want to develop massive renewable energy. One is space, for instance, in many, like, you know, you talked about nuclear, and I agree with you that is very expensive and very dangerous, but, you know, the space you need to produce 1 gigawatt with nuclear energy is considerably smaller than, I mean, you need a lot of space for wind farms, for solar panels and all that. And especially in the developing world, these very large projects are actually getting into tribal lands and traditional communities and all that. And then there is another thing that makes me wonder about renewable energy, especially all the stuff about batteries and electric cars and all that, is the need for these very rare minerals, these very rare metals, and there's probably which are also environmentally, they may be, some of them are abundant, some of them are scarce, but they are all environmentally very problematic to mine, and they need a lot of water and all that. And I wonder why, I mean, you have shown us a really, like a great story of renewable energy going up, but it's all based on growth, okay? But what is the feeling among these countries in China of opting for, and I think that Japan is doing that a lot, opting a little bit more for, looking more for energy efficiency, for decoupling growth from energy use or water use and all that. So it's a bunch of questions put in one, but I just convey them to you.
They're tough questions, but I've been kind of answering these before in previous talks. So they're familiar. Okay. They're familiar tough questions.
Okay.
They're familiar tough questions. So I think in answer to your, let's go for the second question first, second thing you've asked for. What you need with anything to do with climate change is a systems thinking approach. It's not just solar panels that are going to save the planet. It's solar panels combined with smart grid technology, where we're integrating digital tech and other technologies such as battery storage power, and also education about, solar power. And also you need to have a recycling system, as you rightly pointed out. Storage batteries rely on lithium. Solar PV relies on polysilicon. 2% of China's steel production is used to make wind turbines. Okay, so it's not just the technology itself, which is the fix. That's the thing. It's part of the fix. You need a systems approach. You also need to think out of the box, keep on innovating. So on space, for example, very, very valid points. I mentioned earlier in my talk that onshore wind is okay maybe when you've got huge amounts of space, which is unpopulated. But the future, I think, of wind energy is offshore. Right, so Britain happens to be the world leader in offshore at the moment because we're island nation. We've got a continental shelf in the North Sea, which is quite shallow, so you can plant the wind turbines quite easily. Japan and South Korea can't do that so easily because they've got very slopey sea shelves that go down, because it's very mountainous countries. They haven't got a continental shelf with just about 20 meters deep where you can easily plant a very large wind turbine. But they are creating now floating wind turbines, which are anchored by cables down and floating. So all very, very clever technology. So that's the solution on that front. Solar PV. I also don't like, when I'm on the train looking at these huge solar parks, fields converted into solar panels, basically. But what they're doing at the moment is generating solar PV technology that can be integrated into glass, which means you can convert your windows can be solar PV panels or other building material. So that would get around the kind of space problem. These are got very high rates of techno innovation where there's increasing investment going in to make solar power and wind and geothermal and tidal and biomass increasingly affordable and increasingly better what they do. But you need to have a systems approach where you need to think about everything, how everything's are connected. So yeah, tough question. But I've never given the good enough answer.
Very clever answers as well. So there you go.
Thanks.
Maybe someone else from the audience wants to ask?
I've got I think it's from, is it?
I can see the chat for some reason, so please go ahead.
Can you see the chat?
I don't know why.
So this one is from, I think, is it from Maria? The post-COVID period can bring a rethinking to the globalization of supply chains. Concerning foreign investment in East Asia, will it have an impact on climate change, energy consumption, and CO2 emissions? Okay, Maria, what I can say to you is, because I kind of also look at how businesses are becoming more sustainable. When you are a large kind of company, you are responsible not just directly for the CO2 emissions which you have generated yourself at your own factories or offices or distribution centers with your fleet of vehicles. You're also, you could argue, responsible for the supply chain emissions that come from your suppliers or from the extraction of materials, and also further kind of downstream to your retail outlets where you're transporting stuff from your factories to the retail outlets. So these are called scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. The scope 3 emissions are your supply chain emissions. Now, Apple introduced a scheme in 2015 called the Clean Energy Supply or something like that program, where all their major suppliers had to, like Apple Incorporated, sign up to become to reduce all their carbon emissions by the year 2030 or 2040. So you've got a big apex producer like Apple with multiple supply chains, and most of these big suppliers, by the way, are in China. If you look at this program, which comprises at the moment about 44 companies, about 30 of them are actually located in China, others in Taiwan, and some in South Korea. So it's business trying to take responsibility for and working together to reduce across the supply chain their emissions. And Asian countries and companies are kind of involved in this process. And it's increasingly expected for big high-profile brand companies to be doing this, not just in their own company, but also having a net positive effect elsewhere in the business community. And there's an increasing number of business coalitions working on this. So, for example, there's an organization called RE100, and it's 300 major companies which have signed up to become completely zero carbon on their emissions by, I think it's 2030. So this is happening in the business sector, in these kind of areas anyway. So yeah. Hope that answered your question a bit there for you, Maria. Do come back to me, anyone, if you've got any other...
Well, we are reaching to the end, time flies.
Okay.
We are reaching to the end of the lecture, and I don't know if Blay or David, do you want to have any final comment or any final question?
Just to thank again Professor Dent for his talk. I think it's been really interesting, and he's able to go to really important things, I would argue. And for us, it's at least for me, it's been a real pleasure, as I said at the beginning, and he hasn't disappointed at all. And he's been very, very, very interesting. So thank you very much, and thank you very much also to Casa Asia for helping us in organizing the event. Maybe Blay, do you want to say something to?
Yes, thanks. Well, it was illuminating a lot of food for thought. So thanks so much, Chris. Professor Dent was very, very interesting. I was wondering if maybe in these 2-3 minutes that we have, if you can just talk a bit more about this concept of climate diplomacy, that it's very interesting for us, because I was also thinking on vaccine diplomacy and how China is playing a key role here. So also in climate diplomacy, and also connecting with the next lecture that will be in April 8th, and Professor Jimin Park from Sciences Po and Seoul National University will talk about K-pop diplomacy. So in the case of South Korea. So let's talk a little bit on climate diplomacy and China, maybe. I guess that's China here.
Yes, certainly. So climate diplomacy really had its kind of origins back in the United Nations efforts to address environmental issues. So the United Nations at the kind of global level of climate diplomacy has been very much at the center of this. So after a number of multilateral kind of meetings on the environment. The first was in Stockholm in 1972. In the late 80s, they established the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, of which the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement were part of. The Conference of Parties, COP, annual summits about climate. Now, what's happened since then is a kind of a very diverse proliferation of climate diplomacy at various levels, including various different actors. So, for example, there's a C40 cities group on climate diplomacy, cities working together on it. There are various civil society organizations involved in the diplomacy process. So this is amongst themselves, but also, with other actors. So you get, civil society organizations turning up to COP meetings. Business are increasingly active in climate diplomacy as well. The Paris Pledge is a thing where big companies can sign up themselves, not just nation states, but companies can sign up to meeting the Paris goals on reducing global temperatures by 2050. So it's happening at multiple levels, climate diplomacy. And Asian countries are part of, and cities are part of this process. But it maybe still is perceived as being driven by Western organizations. But I think that Asian actors will become increasingly important, because this is where we need to take the most urgent action on climate is in East Asia, as I've hopefully explained.
Thanks so much. So thank you so much. It was a remarkable and a wonderful conference lecture to start our lecture series. So please, David.
Well, thank you very much as well.
Again, thank you all for coming and attending, and thank you to Casa Asia for helping us, and thank you to Christopher for Dent for his talk. On my part, nothing else really.
Well, thank you all very much. It's lovely to see you. Thanks for turning up, and I wish you all well. Hope to see you again in face to face.
Yeah, face to face. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye bye.
And bye bye
everyone.
Bye bye everyone. Bye bye.